Mr. Chairman, we've been talking a lot today about the cost of transition to a new lower carbon economy. I have a couple of slides, several slides I'd like to share that put this into perspective of the cost of not making this transition. If the tech people can put up the first slide for me, what this is several 100,000 years of CO2 in the atmosphere. Many people talk about natural variations, and as you can see from this chart, there are natural variations, but if you look at the far right side of the chart, we're way outside of those natural variations. We're well above now 400 parts per million of CO2. This is a vivid demonstration of the fact that we're in uncharted territory. In fact, it's not really uncharted. 3 million years ago was the last time we had 400 parts per million, and by the way, the oceans were about 60 feet higher. Speaking of the oceans, if you can put up chart number 2, this is a really fascinating piece of data. This is 24,000 years of history, and the low point on the left is the height of the Ice Age. It was when a huge amount of water was locked up in the glaciers, and what you see is the increasing depth of the ocean. It's about 390 feet of difference between 24,000 years ago and today. There are two important things I want to point out on this chart. You'll see in the middle, there's a very steep incline of increasing water depth called Meltwater Pulse 1A. The reason that's significant is that during that period, the ocean level rose a foot a decade. And many scientists believe that we're in a similar moment right now. The point I'm trying to make is this is not science fiction. This has happened in the past. And the other interesting thing about this chart is if you go over to the right where you see it sort of levels off at the top, that's the current sea level. It's about the last 8,000 years. 8,000 years happens to be recorded human history. In other words, the oceans have been where they are, and we all think of them as being constant. The point of this chart is that in fairly recent times, 25,000 years, they haven't been constant at all. The Chesapeake Bay 15,000 years ago was a nice river valley of the Susquehanna River. It was mostly dry land. So the whole East Coast would move about 180 miles east 15,000, 20,000 years ago during the Ice Age. Here's the third chart, which talks about the practical effects of what we're looking at. This is ice concentration in the Arctic. It's reduced by 75% in the last 40 years. The point I'm making is we're talking a lot today about the cost of transition. We also have to talk about the cost of not transitioning and the dramatic impacts that we're facing. You want to rebuild Miami or New Orleans or New York, Washington, D.C., any coastal communities. If we're talking about 6 to 8 feet of sea level rise in the next century, that is a catastrophe, both a human catastrophe and an economic catastrophe. So I just wanted to, we're talking about baseline in this hearing, and I wanted to talk about the fact that we are in a very, very dangerous time and facing what I think could be catastrophic changes, if not within our lifetime, certainly within the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. A couple of questions. Dr. Su and John Barrasso, Senator Barrasso mentioned this. Given the magnitude of this problem and the fact that it is an international problem and that there are developing countries that don't have the technological and industrial base that we have, wouldn't a good adjunct to the climate, the Paris Climate Agreement be technology sharing? This should be an international moonshot, if you will, to develop the technologies both for efficiency and for carbon-free production. Dr. Su, is that something we should be working on? Bearing in mind, I've already used a lot of my time, but give me a couple of sentences on that, please.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. Thank you for the question. But I also think it's not just about technology sharing and cooperation, but it's also about competition. We can also compete as the U.S. in promoting clean technologies abroad and accessing markets that are now growing in their demand for clean technology because of their decarbonization goals and their targets under the Paris Agreement. So I think that there is even more opportunity for green competition as well, and not just technology sharing.
Great. Mr. Mills, I want to understand your testimony. You're talking about the costs of building batteries, for example, and I understand there are environmental costs. There's no free lunch in energy. I learned that a long time ago. However, are you saying that the emissions that go into the manufacturing of a single car battery would be equal to the emissions saved by that car battery in an electric car over, say, 150,000 miles of a 10-year life? Is that, are you, I don't think you're saying that, but I just want to be sure.
Senator, thanks for the question. I am saying that. In fact, there's very robust studies on this. I was not speaking to the economic costs because the baseline I believe we were talking about were emissions. I was pointing out that the emissions associated with the energy consumed to fabricate batteries to make and process the key minerals and materials are significant, that the data show in numerous academic, these are not, studies promoted by advocates of either forms of energy. The analyses of what it's involved in the fuel cycle to make the battery materials, the range of energy costs, not dollar costs, to fabricate a barrel's oil equivalent of energy storage consumes 100 to 300 barrels of oil of energy to fabricate that quantity of batteries. So that,
but my question is, how many barrels of oil would be offset by that battery over a 10-year life?
Very fair question. It does. It offsets over its life oil. It depends on where the cars exist. So in the world that exists today, batteries that are fabricated with the way we now do it result in emissions that are only partly offset depending on where they're driven. One of the European studies finds if you drive the Tesla in Norway, for example, half of the emission savings you have by not burning oil are wiped out by making the electric car. If you drive the vehicle in most of Germany, 2/3 of all the emission savings are wiped out. And if you drive it in Poland, obviously they have an electric grid that's coal-fired, then you have net increase in emissions. So yes, I was saying exactly that. That's what needs to be part of the account.
Well, I'd appreciate if you could supply those studies for the record for the committee. I'd be very interested in following up.
Yes.
One final comment, not a question. I know my time is up. I want to associate myself with Senator Hirono. The low-hanging fruit of climate change prevention is methane. And most of the methane comes from unregulated oil and gas drilling, whether it's in Russia or here. I think that's an area where we need to lead, but we also could be talking to Russia about some kind of methane treaty, if you will, because it's cost effective. We ought to be doing it, and it's by far the easiest, shortest, and most cost effective way to deal with climate change. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.